Anger erupts on the streets in cities across Iran as demonstrators rally against soaring oil prices. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. In a nation already crippled by U.S. sanctions, a decision by the Iranian government to hike fuel prices has triggered violent protests. Stores and banks have been set on fire and highways barricaded. Amnesty International has put the death toll at more than 100. Information is hard to come by. Iran imposed a widespread internet blackout for several days. In a region rocked with discontent, could Iran's deepening malaise lead to a new call for reform and change? To discuss the unrest in Iran, let's bring in our panel. Mohammad Marandi is a professor of English literature at the University of Tehran. He joins us from Iran. With us here in Washington in our studio, Barbara Slavin is director at the Future of Iran Initiative with the Atlantic Council. Joining us from Beirut, Lebanon, Sharmine Narwani is a journalist and analyst covering Mideast geopolitics. And also on set is Negar Mortazavi. She's a diplomatic correspondent for The Independent. Welcome to all of you to the show. Mohammad Marandi, let me start with you. So we have these demonstrations in cities across Iran. They've taken to the streets in protests against the increase in oil prices, but it's turned political. Some are now even demanding that clerical leaders step down, and as I pointed out, Amnesty International puts the death toll at 106. What is your view of what is going on, and how is the government responding to this?
I think you have to make a distinction, and this is something that the Western media chooses not to do, and that is that there are the protests and there are the riots. The protests on the first day, they were large in number, some say up to 100,000 collectively across the country, and they were in protest to the fuel hikes. But late in the evening, we saw a sudden rise in violence carried out by groups that were well organized, and they started attacking banks, fuel stations, as well as ambulances and public services. And therefore, the protesters really disappeared from the street the next day because they saw what was happening. So from day two, there were no longer protesters. It was rioters that were spread across different cities, and they had replaced the protesters. And the violence was very severe. 5 to 6 police officers, people who were on the streets, were killed in different cities during the 2 days where the riots were very severe, 2.5 days. And someone even told me 9 officers, but that's not confirmed yet. So it was very violent. They had arms, they had swords, they had iron bars, and they had a lot of equipment. So some of these groups, they would destroy banks one after another within literally minutes. They would move from one bank to another.
And what is the government saying about the initial protests against the fuel price increases?
Well, everyone here, whether it's the administration or those opposing the administration, they all accepted the right for people to protest against the fuel hikes. And many believe that the government mismanaged it. We woke up in the morning and discovered that the price of fuel went from 8 to 24 cents a liter, more or less. That's the equivalent. Of course, it's still very cheap compared to other countries, but it increased threefold. It was a big shock, and people were very angry. The government only started to explain afterwards that they planned to redistribute the money. In other words, the money that they got from the increase in the increased fuel price, they would give to the 70% of the population that had lower incomes. But they really mismanaged it. And for 4 years, they kept the price of fuel the same, and then suddenly threefold. It was badly mismanaged. I think there's a consensus that fuel prices have to increase because a lot is being smuggled outside the country and consumption is rising very fast, and there's a fear that Iran would become a net importer, and that would give the Americans leverage if they blocked Iranian gasoline imports. But still, a sudden threefold increase in the prices was a big shock.
Negar, you've been monitoring the situation very closely. I've seen your reports in the independent newspaper. What is your reading of what is going on there right now?
Well, first of all, we have to remember the internet is shut down, so most Iranians are cut off from sharing a lot of the information and images, especially to the outside world. So it's very hard to paint an actual visual picture of what's going on the ground. But from the slow number of videos and photos that are coming out, it seems like it's very violent. As the guest in Tehran is saying, there's a high amount of violence, but also by the security forces. There are videos of security forces actually directly shooting at protesters. Amnesty International has this number of deaths that experts are saying is probably a lower estimate, and it could, from the violence that we're seeing in images, the number could actually be higher than this estimate. It's just that it seems like the brutality basically of the crackdown is something that's very vivid from the images that we see, and it's also centered in some of the areas where there's a high number of ethnic and religious minorities, like Khuzestan, like Kurdistan, where there have been other grievances, not just economic and political, and it seems like there's different layers to all of this as far as the protests, the violence, and also the crackdown.
The Wall Street Journal is also reporting that there are pro-government demonstrations takes place as well now. Do you know anything about that?
In some cities, there have been pro-government demonstrations. The government are saying some of them were basically not coordinated and spontaneous. It's hard to verify that, but it's been a pattern that government would bring their own supporters, and there are government or regime supporters, of course, high number as well, and they would bring them to the street in a show of defiance to the protesters. But what we have to remember is that this wasn't a new thing. These protests have been going on since the end of 2017 and then 18, and then we're just reignited again with this hike in fuel price, and the grievances are still there, basically.
Barbara, what is your assessment of what is going on in Iran right now, and how significant is the fact that these were protests that initially, these protests started against the fuel price hike, and they've morphed a little bit into protests, political protests against the government?
Yeah, well, as Negar pointed out, I mean, these kinds of protests are not new for Iran. If you look at, you know, the fact that they had a revolution 40 years ago, and that the government repeatedly calls people out into stage demonstrations on a variety of dates, the anniversary of the revolution, the anniversary of the takeover of the U.S. Embassy 40 years ago. So people are used to coming out in the streets, and there have been violent protests really repeatedly over the last 20, 30 years in Iran, caused by a variety of things, whether it was fraud in a 2009 election or economic reasons. I think what's concerning, and again, it's been pointed out, we don't have all the facts because of the way the government has very effectively shut down the internet over the last few days. These protests don't appear to have a leader. They don't appear to have organization, despite what Professor Marandi said. They appear to just reflect the hopelessness of people that their government is not able to improve their economic situation. Of course, we have economic sanctions imposed by the United States as well. I think there's just a lack of hope and a lack of belief in the system that Iran has, that any faction can deliver a better future for them.
Has the situation been exploited, Barbara, by others who bent on violence, really? We've seen a lot of violence.
You know, it's possible. Again, it's difficult to know what is actually going on the ground. Clearly, outside Iran, there are opponents of the Iranian government that are jumping on this and calling it a new uprising, calling it a new revolution, even hyping the casualty figures, and trying to use this as an example of, you know, that regime change is coming. Yeah. But we've been hearing this for years, and the government maintains a monopoly on the use of force, and as Negar pointed out, is using it very, very brutally to nip these demonstrations in the bud.
Okay, let me bring in Sharmine Narwani. She's in Lebanon. Sharmine, there have been protests in Iran before, as our guests have pointed out here, but do you get the sense that these protests are different in any way?
I mean, I suspect that these ones are going to be more short-lived than the ones in the past. You know, from what I recall in recent history, we have the 2009 ones, which dragged on for over a year. Then we had a brief fling with an Iranian Spring in 2011, in which foreign countries openly tried to subvert, and then again in 2017, 2018, we saw these headless protests, which seemed to be marked more by economic discontent than any other political issue. And these ones, the reason I think they're going to be short goes to what Mohammad said. The peaceful element of the protests, where people swelled onto the streets, was very short-lived and was swiftly taken over by smaller groups of mostly males destroying public and private property. And what's really interesting, and I think may provide some insight into what's going on today, may be a poll taken by the University of Maryland in Iran. They take annual polls there, taken immediately after the 2018 protests, in which they saw that economy was the #1 issue pretty much across the board, and issues like lack of civil liberties, came in at less than 1%. But in this case, what's more interesting is that poll in 2018 specifically names that 86% of Iranians were against fuel price hikes, and 72% of Iranians at the time were concerned that the government was not doing enough for the poor. So the government now knows that they had to do a fuel price hike for various reasons that have been explained. And they thought the way to do it, I think, was to distribute the funds, the $2.25 billion reaped from this, to the 18 million Iranian families who needed it most. But of course, they rolled it out very badly, and which is why you saw people come to the street in the first day. And the more people understood what was happening, that died down. So, I think this is going to be short-lived, because the government will come down very, very hard on the violent protesters that we're seeing now.
What do you make of that poll, Barbara, the fact that Iranians are concerned about the economy, about their pocketbooks, really?
Well, I think that's true of people all over. I think there's another aspect that we haven't brought in, and that is that this is region-wide, in some sense global. There are protests going on in a lot of countries over economic conditions in some places, but also against corruption and against the entrenched elite in so many places, and in the region, in Iraq and in Lebanon, and the kind of contagion. But obviously, the fuel price hike was, as the other speakers have said, very abruptly done. Why not do it in stages? Why make it so extreme? And why not put the money in the bank accounts of Iranians before you announce the hike? That would make a lot of sense, it would seem to me. I don't know why they didn't do that.
Mohammad Marandi, interesting questions raised there by Barbara Slavin. Why didn't the government do this in stages, and why didn't they help people out, finance families before they implemented the hike?
Well, this is one important point that I think has to be kept in mind, and that when in the Western media they say the government, pro-government and anti-government. In Iran, you have different political parties, different factions, and this debate, and those who are opposed to the government inside Iran, they have been making the same, they've been raising the same questions. Why didn't they give the money beforehand? The government says they didn't have the necessary amount of money to do so, but in any case, that's an ongoing debate. So contrary to what we often seem to hear in the West, is that there is open discussion in the country, and like any other country, because one of your guests in the studio said the government has a monopoly of force. That's the same. The same is true with the United States and Great Britain, and the same is true in France with the yellow vests and so on. So, with regards to the brutality, I think that it's been quite obvious that on day one we had protests in many different countries, and those protests passed off peacefully. No one was killed. From day two, the protests disappeared. They became rioters. They became riots. The footage is out there for people to see. So if we want to insist that the protests and the riots are the same thing, we can, but it's simply not true. So when the rioters attack police stations, and apparently one police station was taken, then people are going to get killed. If a police station is attacked in the United States or in Britain or anywhere else in the world, that is what's going to happen. So I think when it comes to Iran, there's a certain double standard that exists. violence, apparently the government should not have a monopoly, and those who are destroying banks, those who are destroying ambulances, those who are destroying public services, somehow their cause is legitimate. So we have to make that distinction. If we don't, we're simply misleading a Western audience.
Right. Negar, the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, Ali Larijani, is placing blame for this unrest on what he termed foreign foes and opposition forces. This is what he had to say. Let's watch.
When the impudent U.S. foreign minister openly supported setting fire on people's properties, shamelessly and with foolish opportunism, calling this his support for the people of Iran, he showed his trumped-up and hypocritical behavior towards the nation of Iran, and that the U.S. purpose for Iran is nothing but messing up the security of the country and setting the nation's interests on fire.
Does the Speaker have a point there?
Well, there are forces, as Barbara said, rivals of Iran in the region and across the world, also the United States, who wish that they could have this kind of influence. But an Iranian user on social media actually put it where Will said in the past 40 years, no opposition force has been able to bring people to the street overnight like our government has been. The protests were ignited by a hike in fuel price, not the night before, not the week before, not the month before, the morning after this hike was announced. And it's just, it also shows to the distrust of people in different factions of the political system as far as bringing their money to their pockets, because the government is promising to basically use the money saved from the subsidies to then distribute it to the poor. But it just doesn't seem like the impoverished actually put that trust in the system. And we have to also remember the high level of corruption on top of the mismanagement. And what people are seeing is that high officials who are related to massive corruption cases, driving fancy cars, using the resources to basically pay for high lifestyles, but people are the ones who have to take the pressure, not only from the economic problems internally, but also from the US sanctions that are also contributing to the crisis they're facing.
Right. Sharmine Narwani, talking about sanctions, the United States Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says that the U.S. will now turn up the pressure on Iran. Let's listen to what he had to say.
President Rouhani recently announced that Iran will begin uranium enrichment activities at the Fordow facility. Therefore, the United States will terminate the sanctions waiver related to the nuclear facility at Fordow, effective December 15th, 2019. The right amount of uranium enrichment for the world's largest state sponsor of terror is 0.
So, Sharmine, what do you make of that? Is the situation going to get worse now in Iran with the tightening of sanctions?
Yeah, there comes a point where there's nothing left to sanction, and I think we're closely approaching, that place. I just want to make a point. I have a different opinion slightly than Negar on this, in terms of, U.S. perhaps infiltration or subversion and Western subversion of these protests. It's not like they act the moment things happen in Iran, people hit the streets. These are things that are planned well in advance to when an opportunity presents itself, therefore, to go into action. And, the internet is shut down in Iran, but why is the internet shut down in Iran? They've never done something like this for this much time, for these many days. The U.S. military 10 years ago declared the internet as an operational theater. Magazine covers from here to there talk about cyber warfare being the next front of war. All wars that are taking place now are not conventional wars. They're irregular and asymmetrical wars. And subversion and influence through influence operations, propaganda, et cetera, are a main part of these kind of things. So I think, while the U.S. isn't running the show, clearly, because this is, the Iranian people got mad at a price hike, with gas, they will absolutely grab the opportunity to spin the events, So when you're seeing people getting hurt in the streets in Iran today, it's because, of course, the security forces are also, it's true, they're attacking people who are rioting. And just to go back to that 2018 University of Maryland poll, 84% of Iranians, after the 2018 protests, said they support the use of more force by their security forces if people use violence and destroy public and private property. So, you know, we're at a, the Americans are going to play in this game. This is the way of warfare from here on. And you know, they've said they're applying maximum pressure. This summer, the Americans and Iranians were nose to nose, ready to go to war until there was a slight pullback. So, you know, they're going to take every opportunity to have an impact and spin what's happening in Iran.
Negar, you want to respond to that?
I don't disagree with these points, but I think they're secondary. Again, we go back to the mistrust of the people in the system, the economic grievances, the political grievances that are genuine, that are there. If they're not there, nobody can spin anything that's happening on the ground. So we have to make sure what we understand as primary and secondary. And I also wanted to make a point maybe to that line on statements coming from U.S. officials. The U.S. government, basically by crippling sanctions, is partially responsible for the economic crisis that Iranian people are in. So even if they're not spinning the protests or the violence, they're part of the problem and not the solution. So the statements coming don't seem very genuine from someone like Secretary Pompeo, who's boasted about basically helping cripple the Iranian economy, putting Iranians in this kind of economic misery.
Do these protests pose any kind of a threat to the leadership in Iran, do you think, Barbara?
Well, you know, Iran is going to have parliamentary elections next year, presidential elections in 2021. So I think they will affect the factional balance in the country. There's a lot of concern, frankly, that people have just turned off all of the approved politics and parties in Iran, and that there will be very, very low turnout in parliamentary elections in next year, which means that the more well-organized, most likely hardline factions will do well. I wanted to make one other point, and that is in terms of U.S.-Iran relations and any hope for some renegotiation of the nuclear deal or anything like that. I think this is going to make the Iranian government even more resistant to any kind of compromises, more provocative perhaps in its nuclear steps and its regional steps, and
Would the Iranians
I'm very worried about that.
Would the Iranians be justified in resisting it because it was the United States that violated the deal?
Yes, of course, and Iran is amassing new bargaining chips for future negotiations, whether with a second Trump administration or with a Democrat that would follow. But you know, it's a very sensitive time. Of course, there's information warfare going on between both sides, and other parties are involved. And I just think the next few months are going to be very difficult. I'm very worried about the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Actions, the 2015 nuclear deal, that it really will completely fall apart even before our 2020 presidential elections. So it's, you know, Iranian leaders are obviously on edge and have a right to be, but there are a lot of pent-up grievances, certainly by the Iranian people.
Mohammad Marandi, the government has said that it will provide financial assistance to people who are struggling with these new price hikes. Do you think that could be some kind of safety valve in Iran, or will these protests continue?
Well, the protests have ended because, as I said, the riots replaced them. But people are still upset with the government policy, and opponents in parliament have been attacking the government relentlessly since. So we have to see if people over the next few weeks feel that they are benefiting from the subsidies, then things may change. But we only have 4 months left till parliamentary elections, and the government carried this out in a very ineffective and detrimental way. So I'm not sure it's going to have they're going to do well in the elections. But there are a couple of points that I'd like to point out. One is that, you know, in the West, we often hear that Iran is unpopular, people hate it, people are disillusioned, and so we've been hearing this for 4 decades. And across the region, we hear how deeply despised Iran is in the Western media, in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, everywhere. But then we also hear that Iran is a rising threat. This is a irresolvable paradox. It can't be both things at the same time. If Iran is so unpopular at home and abroad, if the political order in Iran is so widely despised, then it can't really be a threat. It should be collapsing. And so I think that this is partially wishful thinking on behalf of Iran's antagonists in the West. And one of the reasons I'd like to add that why the internet was shut down is because the United States has thousands of foot soldiers waging online warfare in Iran and Albania. The MEK terrorist organization, they're based there, and they are a cult, and the Americans are using them. The Saudis have their own online army, and therefore this alone is evidence about how the United States is using the internet. But in addition, in the UK, when we had riots, I think it was in 2011, where 5 or 6 people were killed in London and Birmingham, the UK was about to shut down Facebook and social media, BlackBerry as well, because they were being used by the rioters. But the difference between Iran and Western countries is that these outlets cooperate with Western intelligence, cooperate with Western security forces, they cooperate with the police. But in the case of Iran, even if a bank is being robbed, Western Facebook or WhatsApp or none of these will cooperate with Iran. So the government has no option but to shut down these outlets because they are being used by the rioters to gather people across the board. And in the UK, people went to prison for encouraging people to gather in London in certain places. 4 years, a couple of people were sentenced to jail for 4 years.
Barbara, what about Dr. Marandi's point there that how can Iran be a country that's been brought to its knees by sanctions and at the same time pose such a big threat?
Well, this is one area where I agree with him. It is ridiculous to try to claim both. But I think there's clear evidence that people in Lebanon and Iraq are angry at Iranian influence in their countries. They're angry at the elite, which they view as corrupt and entrenched. You know, I think that there are many in Iran who do not like their government's policy of intervention in these countries and would prefer that Iran's limited resources at a time of U.S. sanctions be spent exclusively in Iran and not helping Hezbollah or being involved in Iraq. So, look.
May I respond to that briefly?
In a moment. I'll get you. Finish your thought.
Yeah, I just, you know, I also disagree with Professor Marandi about the wisdom of shutting down the internet, because what happens is that wild rumors are spread, many of them by enemies of the Iranian government. I mean, we've seen some incredible stuff, frankly, by very dubious sources here in Washington. And an open internet would give us a better sense of what's actually going on. And, you know, if these are now riots, not protests, we'd be able to see that for ourselves.
All right, Dr. Marandi, very quickly, I've only got about 20 seconds.
Yes, first of all, it's easy to speak about the internet when it's being controlled by the United States. With regards to Iraq, I was in Iraq with 3 million Iranians just a few weeks ago. 3 million Iranians, and there was no violence because it was during the Karbala ceremony. So the 3 million Iranians were in Iraq and nothing happened. So I think it's best when our guests say some Iraqis, some Lebanese, some Iranians, instead of saying Iranians are like this, Iraqis are like that. Then I think the audience can have a more balanced view.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.